Welcome to the Music Ed Matters podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Emily Williams-Birch, and this podcast, it exists for you. Whether you're a music lover, an educator, a choir member, each week we bring guests to the show to help explore what matters in music. I'm so glad that you're here. Welcome to the show. Hello and welcome to the Music Ed Matters podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Emily Williams-Birch, and I am joined by my friend and co-host, Alex Gartner. Hi, Alex.
Hello, Emmy. Thanks for having me again.
Who are we having on the podcast today?
Okay, so we are talking to Ruth Hartt. Ruth runs a blog called Culture for Hire, and we came across her at the most recent Chorus America conference in San Francisco. She was leading a keynote that really just kind of shifted the room. The room was vibrating during her session because the things that she was talking about, especially around the art of relevance in the arts world, just really started shifting perspectives. You could see around the room that light bulbs were going off, pens were furiously writing. Ruth's work centers largely on the messaging that arts organizations send out into their community, under the premise that audiences, even before the pandemic, have started to decline. And how do we get them back? And it all comes back to kind of the message and the purpose and the why that we are sending out into our communities. So we're excited to talk to her today.
In this conversation, Ruth gives all the tips and all the tricks for getting started. And it's not one of those things where, you could totally sit down and turn this into like a Saturday work session or a big, huge board retreat. But really, Ruth breaks it down into small, manageable pieces. Start here and try this. All these little things you can do along the way so that you're shifting your perspective and hopefully attracting what Ruth calls as the outsiders, people, the 48% that feel they are not invited. So this is a great conversation with Ruth. And what was so much fun is Alex and I were sitting at that table during the keynote. And this is so much like chapter 1 in our book, but Ruth takes it a whole different direction. While we talk about how do you communicate what it is that you do and the value to other people when you need to kind of find what their values and their interests are, Ruth takes that same idea and applies it to marketing and building audiences, whether the audience is legit your audience or the numbers of singers or whatever. So we are so excited to bring you Ruth Hartt and Culture for Hire. This episode is brought to you by our friends over at Perform International. We are so excited that they make the Music Ed Matters podcast possible. Go over and check it out so you can figure out where you want to go on tour next year. Can't wait to see you there. Today on the Music Ed Matters podcast, we have our favorite co-host, Alex Gartner. What's up, Alex?
Hey, Emmy. Thanks for having me again.
And I am so excited for our guest, Ruth Hartt. Hello, Ruth.
Hi, guys. So fun to be here with you.
Yay! Ruth is with Culture for Hire, and Alex and I were sitting at a table at one of the opening sessions for Chorus America in San Francisco this summer, and Ruth got up and did this dynamite presentation, and the whole time we're like, because it was such a great extension of so much of the things we wrote in our book. So we are so excited for this conversation. Thank you for making time.
Oh, happy to be here. Happy to be here.
All right, first things first. Who are you? Where are you from? How did you get into this whole Culture for Hire thing?
Well, how much do you want to know? It's a very long, winding story.
I love stories. The cool part is every story is so different. You can tell us as much or as little as you would like.
Well, where am I from? I grew up in Maine, and I started out, my musical training began in piano. And then in high school, I shifted to singing, and that's what got me into choral music. I was in the Maine All-State course for 3 years and had the most amazing conductors, Andre Thomas, Rodney Eichenberger, F. Eli, and it was the most inspirational experience. So, of course, I had to be a music ed major in my undergraduate degree. But while I was there, I got bitten by the opera bug. And so it sort of shifted into that world in the last few years of my undergrad and then further on. Taught chorus and music in as many different levels as I could over the next few years. And then went back to Boston University to get my master's in opera. And then pursued a singing career sort of alongside the whole, choral conducting, music education thing, as many musicians do. You cobble it all together, right?
Yeah.
And then I made a very dramatic career pivot. I decided I wanted like a real job that, paid the bills. We were starting a family, so it seemed like the right move. And so I landed an administrative role at a research organization. And it was a life-changing experience for me. And we'll get into that later a little bit more in depth, but it really changed my perspective on the arts and on audience development and what it means to be an artist and what art appreciation means as well in the 21st century. So it's been a winding road, but really, really fascinating one.
Did you perform when you first started teaching? Because you said you got bit by the opera bug. So you then went and taught chorus, but were you still performing? And what were some of the performances you did?
I did it. For a while, I was just sort of studying voice on the side, but definitely started to dabble in performing. I did the Young Artist Program with Port Opera up here in Maine, which is now, I think it's called Opera Maine. And then, performed with some regional groups like orchestras and choirs and some smaller opera companies as well. And it just sort of grew from there.
Awesome. Okay, so you're doing all this educating. You've gotten bit by the opera bug. You go, you perform, you do your thing, and then you take this admin job and your mind is blown. How did that happen?
Yeah, well, so the organization I landed at was a nonprofit research organization started by a Harvard Business School professor. And in my mind, this was just, I'm going to get a job that pays the bills. But as I sat there sort of absorbing all of these ideas and frameworks that this professor had developed, I started to have this sort of like light bulb moment where I was like, these ideas could be really useful in the arts world. So the organization was started by Clayton Christensen. He is, little did I know, I had never heard of him before, but he is a world-renowned business thinker. He wrote 12 best-selling books that completely changed the business world's way of thinking about innovation and about creating sustainable organizations and about attracting customers. And at the Institute, we actually take those frameworks and we apply them to pressing issues in the social sector. So we're trying to transform the conversation around education and healthcare and poverty. And so it sort of naturally progressed in my mind to, well, what about these other worlds? What about the world of the arts? We have this problem of audience decline, right? We have this problem of attracting customers in the arts world. And so what does that look like if I apply these frameworks, to that world? And so that just sort of got me on a deep dive of, reading and researching. And I started a blog, which ended up kind of snowballing pretty quickly. I think this was right in the middle of the pandemic. And I think arts organizations were kind of desperate, right, for new ideas, new ways of thinking about, what does our sector look like, post-pandemic. And so it just sort of grown from there.
So the post-pandemic time for choirs has been very different. I think the COVID era for choirs was really challenging for everybody, absolutely, but everybody emerged slightly differently, and I think it has a little bit to do with how people approached the relevance that choir has in their community. Could you talk a little bit about the trends that you're seeing for choirs or musical organizations that seem to be kind of on the rise or successful? What trends are you seeing from them?
Well, I start with, like you say, the problem of relevance. That's really key to the work that I do. And I think what we're seeing, especially with COVID, but really before COVID, the 2 decades leading up to COVID, what we're seeing is that our relevance has been decreasing every year in the arts world, particularly classical music. This is reflected in our ticket sales. The National Endowment for the Arts says that live audiences for classical music have declined by almost 50% since the early 2000s. And so relevance is a real issue. And the other issue is around outsiders not feeling welcome. The number is 48% of the US population reports that they don't feel welcome in the classical music world. So that's a huge number, a huge problem. Wow. And I think the solution is, multifaceted, of course, but I focus on three solutions that I believe are the most important. The first is, if we want outsiders to feel welcome, we need to bring the audience experience into the 21st century. We need to start thinking about what traditions we've brought with us from the 19th century and how that needs to shift now that we are where we are in the world that we are today. I think there's also around the idea of relevance. I think there's a real important shift we need to make from this reverence of our art, this centering of our art, to this outward facing perspective where we're now centering the needs of the people in our communities. And then finally, the third, which I harp on a lot, is that our marketing or our outreach tends to be very, what I call egocentric. It's very self-referential. And that does not speak to the 21st century customer. When we look at marketing in, what I call the real world, where consumers are spending their days, it's very different from the marketing that they're seeing out there. And so I think that third solution is creating marketing that actually speaks to the 21st century customer. And it's all about understanding the people in our community and having empathy for them and creating marketing around what we know about their needs, their struggles, and how they interact with the world. So in terms of, you were asking who's doing it well, not a lot of people, unfortunately. Not a lot of organizations, which is why I harp on this so much on my blog. I last year spent some time, I looked at about 185 arts organizations' websites across the globe. And this was, orchestras, choirs, ballet companies, etc. And I found one that I thought was actually taking a customer-centric, audience-focused approach, and that was Opera Australia. And what they do on their website is they focus in on how their art form can be a solution for a need that their community is facing. So their headline on their website was "Escape Ordinary," right? And it's not, instead of, our art can make you feel cultured, our art is the epitome of refinement. It was, hey, if you're bored, you're tired of sitting on the couch after COVID, if you feel like life is mundane, come to an opera, right? This is going to be your escape. This is not ordinary. This is something completely different. And so that I thought was a really genius approach.
So how did sorry, Alex, you want to follow up? Sorry.
I do have a tangent, just because I know a lot of choir directors will be listening to this. I came from the school early in my career that marketing was sort of like an afterthought, a shot in the dark, a necessary evil, something that can be expensive without a visual return on investment. And I've modified my view of that now. And I wonder what you might say to those who may hold some of those beliefs as well in terms of marketing.
Well, here's the thing. Do you want people to come to your concerts? And some, I have encountered some people who say, it's not our job to be relevant. It's our job to create music. Or, we can still do what we do without an audience. We're here for the singers, right? We're here to make art. We're here for the art itself. But I would venture to guess that, 99.9% of singers and choral conductors out there do want their music to be shared with their community, do want people to come and experience this art form with them. And so the only solution is to put time, money, and effort into marketing. Does that answer your question?
It does. Thank you.
And that's a perfect segue into my question that was following up from that. You talk on your website about it's a shift in perspective because it's, quote, not about you. And that's a huge shift. How are you helping? Are you going in and coaching people? You've started this culture for hire thing. How are you helping this perspective shift happen?
Well, that is the first step. It's that perspective shift, and it's a huge shift. For me, I'm a former opera singer, right? And so for me, I look back at that time being a singer, and I was just so enthralled with creating my art, pursuing this excellence that I wanted to achieve in my singing, and I really didn't think much about the audiences. It was like, well, they really need to value classical music as much as we do, and that if they did, they would show up. But with this shift in perspective that I gained from my work alongside these researchers at the Institute, it became this realization that that's not how customers think. The frameworks around what drives customers to buy things. It's the idea that people buy things, not because of who they are. It's about who they want to become. And so what they do is they, when they encounter a struggle or a problem in their life or a place where they're trying to make progress, they start to look around their world for solutions. And when they find one that seems like it understands them and their problem well enough, they pull it into their life to help them make progress. And so that's where they hire it to help them make progress. And that's where my blog title comes from, Culture for Hire. So yeah, that perspective shift is key. And I think that's where I typically will start with, an organization when they, reach out and ask me, for consulting or, speaking or a workshop or whatever it is. I think that realization, that perspective shift is so key. And it's important for as many people in an organization as possible to understand it. Because all of a sudden you start to realize, oh, if they're making purchasing decisions or decisions about how they're going to spend their time based on their needs, then we need to understand their needs. And then we need to understand how our offerings tie into their needs, right? And so all of a sudden it becomes our job to show them how we are relevant in their lives and how our solution understands them and is the best solution for the progress that they're making. So I typically will start there with any sort of project that I take on.
And it makes sense. You said show them how we are relevant. And again, on your website, you talk about us making ourselves essential. We have to start being essential. So what are some of these phrases or what are some of these marketing strategies or approaches that you're seeing that are shifted where it's not about us and that are involving making the arts essentials? What are some of these ideas that you've seen? You told us one example.
Yeah. So one organization I worked with last year was a choral organization in Boston, and it was the Seraphim Singers. And they're this incredible group of singers. I think they've been around for 20 years or so. And they perform the most exquisite performances of sacred choral music. And they, like so many other groups, are seeing fewer and fewer people come through their doors. And so they came to me and they said, well, how can we get more people to come? And how can we stand out in this landscape in Boston that is so full of choral organizations? And so I turned that around and I said, I think you're asking the wrong question. I think you need to ask, what are the needs we see in our community that we, as a choral organization that performs sacred choral music, are best positioned to speak to and to address? So the process was all around speaking to consumers and looking at consumer trends. And what we're seeing in the general, world of consumers is a lot of angst, a lot of stress, a lot of anxiety, with everything that's going on in terms of, the pandemic and politics and climate change and all of these issues we're facing, social justice, et cetera. We said, how can we be of service to the community? And what we came down to was this idea of how when you come to a choral concert, there's this de-stressing, this unplugging, this space that you start to add to your life that you don't normally have. And so the focus that we landed on was this idea of space to breathe. And so that became for Seraphim this sort of North Star for the organization, not just for marketing, but for programming as well, for repertoire choices, for the audience experience, for innovating around how they can integrate into the community. And it's incredible how when you focus in on a meaningful purpose like that, outside of just art for art's sake, but not just how do we perform excellent art, but how do we use our art as a vehicle? And that meaningful purpose now becomes this incredible compass for messaging and imagery and, who they market to. Now it's not just the people who know and love choral music, but it's anyone in the community who needs space to breathe, which, let me tell you, is a lot bigger segment of the population.
You've talked about art for art's sake a couple times. We talk about that as well in our book. It's actually one of the premises as to why we wrote it, thinking that, those of us in the business side of running choral organizations, sometimes that part can be so draining, and that we yearn for that time when music is the reason that we are motivated and fueled and all that good stuff. But the shift in the thought about our audience's perspective, that art might not be enough, is kind of like, as you said, that's a really big leap for people who are really entrenched in this arts world. What might you say to those people who are having a hard time letting go of something that is so near and dear to them?
So what I will say is this: art for art's sake, it isn't enough, and here's why. I came to this conclusion after reading this incredible book called The Art of Gathering by Priya Parker. I don't know if you two have read it, but I highly recommend it. It's not about the arts world, but it's incredibly applicable. And so Priya Parker, in her book, she says that the great paradox of gathering is that when what you do seems like a really fantastic reason to gather, like, for instance, when you've been taught that what you do is of utmost importance to the world, like creating art, you end up neglecting this crucial exercise of actually establishing a meaningful purpose, of agreeing together on the why behind what you do. And this happens so much in the classical music world, right? Classical music is sacred. It must be preserved. We have to expose our communities to it. Why? Right? And so if you can ask why or to what end, and you don't see the answer to that question in your mission statement or your strategic plan, you're missing out on an incredible opportunity. And of course, the answer, the question that I get there is, well, but, don't we exist precisely to present excellent classical music to our community, to expose our audiences to artistic excellence and to bring art to the masses? And Priya Parker, according to her framework, would say, no, classical music is the what, not the why, right? It's the product, not the purpose. And so, in other words, excellence is what we do, and it doesn't answer that why or to what end question that we really do have to answer when we're called upon to communicate our value to our community, or to justify funding, or to successfully attract donors and ticket buyers. And so the classical music world, according to Priya Parker, is conflating category with purpose. We're confusing like the product category with an actual purpose. And so when we do this, we end up gathering in ways that don't serve our communities and actually don't really serve our artists either, because we're missing out on this possibility of creating something really, truly memorable and transformative. That's the tip of the iceberg.
Anybody listening needs to rewind to the last 90 seconds of what you just said, because that was snaps for that. I mean, that was incredible.
Because you so articulate. My next question was going to be, what do people do about their mission statements? Because everyone's like, this is why we're doing it. But you like, oh my goodness, that's a whole perspective shift in and of itself. So what do you do to help with organizations? Do they have to rewrite their mission statements, or is this a supportive piece of the mission statement? How do mission statements fit in there? And then I want to jump off and talk about websites in a second.
Yeah. I think mission statements are important. They tend to be an afterthought, and they tend to be a cookie cutter, right? In arts organizations, they tend to have very, very similar language around enriching communities, right? Which still doesn't answer that why question. And so I do think it's important. People tend to say to me, well, do people really read our mission statement? But actually, consumers in 2023 they're making decisions around how they're going to spend their time a little bit differently than they did, say, 10, 20 years ago. They're really values focused, right? So like when you go out and buy a tube of toothpaste, a lot of consumers now are thinking about, how is this toothpaste created? What are the ingredients in here? Is it sustainable? And that the same thing applies to how they spend their leisure time, their entertainment time. And so I do think mission statements do need to be looked at and revised. And the process typically starts with sitting down with an organization and passing out a printout of the mission statement, passing out a red pen and saying, all right, if you are an outsider with absolutely no context for, let's say, choral music or classical music, I want you to look at your mission statement from that viewpoint and cross out any word that would not be relevant or familiar to you. And typically what happens is half of that mission statement is gone. And so now it's around, now the process becomes, all right, so we need to take some time to think about what is the meaningful purpose that we want to address. And this is what's interesting about this process, is all of a sudden you are differentiating yourself from all of the different arts organizations in your community, especially if you're a choral organization and there's 50 other choral organizations. All of a sudden, you're not just saying, well, we stand out because we create excellent choral music, because everyone says that, right? All of a sudden you are saying, okay, we stand out because we provide space to breathe. And here's what that looks like for you as a community member. Here's what that looks like in a concert format. Here's how we do that offline. All of a sudden, all these ideas start to percolate in terms of how we can innovate around this. So it starts with the mission statement, but it gets very deep into selecting a purpose. And then how does everything that we do in our organization change now that we've actually identified that purpose?
And it sounds like there's so much knowledge you have to gain about your community. You have to know your community. That has been a huge conversation in the organizations that I've run and worked with and started, because the needs of the community have shifted so much. And so the what and the why has constantly had to shift, different than where Alex is, because Alex's community has different needs and different desires. So I want to ask, because this was the coolest activity you made us do. It was a very interesting activity. How do these what's and whys and values, and it's not about us, how does that translate to things like a website?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I think what you have to start doing is looking at every element of your marketing, of your website, and say, okay, are we focusing on us, or are we focusing on our customer? And I know the word customer is a little bit taboo in the arts world, but if people are buying tickets, that's who they are. And so there are a couple of different characteristics of what I call egocentric or traditional arts marketing that I always ask people to look for. And the first is that content in this traditional approach tends to be focused on reverence for the art and for the artists. And this includes both copy and imagery. Or worse, it's just listing, the dates and times of your upcoming events. And then language that's used is typically very elevated and flowery, or it sometimes trends towards being vague and doesn't really mean anything at all to the customer. But also, we can fall into the trap of using insider-friendly language. So that means lots of jargon, lots of words that outsiders won't understand, like the word cantata, for example. We know it well. We know exactly what that is, but the average person who doesn't have context around this world won't get it and won't care. Also, the content talks about the organization, talks about the artists, talks from the organization's perspective. So there's lots of the use of the word we and our. And then it's focused on selling a ticket or scoring a donation rather than building buy-in for the customer, right, around what they might be looking for. And then calls to action typically reflect the organization's needs. Support us, donate here, buy a ticket. And then lastly, when there is a review on the website or in the marketing, it's often from a respected and well-known art critic, which, you might say, well, what's wrong with that? But from the customer's perspective, what they want to see to believe that your event has value for them, to believe that you understand them enough to create something that has value, they need to see something completely different. They want to see content that focuses on their life and how your product can help them. Content that highlights needs that real customers have and shows how your offerings can benefit them. They want to see imagery that features real customers engaging with your organization so they can envision themselves there and understand whether they're going to fit in or not. They want to see language that is down to earth, language they understand and language that they use in their everyday life, and also language that speaks directly to them. So lots of use of the word you and your. I also think it's really important to understand that not everyone's ready to dive in and buy a ticket. They might be visiting your website because they just want to get to know you. They want to understand what your values are and whether you understand their world. And so, a giant headline at the top saying, buy your tickets now, or, tickets are on sale today, might not be the best approach. You want to answer questions like, what's in this for me? Will I fit in? What can I expect? And then social proof, rather than, fancy reviews from well-known critics or other artists, bringing in real words from real customers who can testify to the fact that your product actually benefited them and their lives, and here's how that happened. That's actually going to have a lot more impact for these outsiders that we're looking to attract.
I want to talk repertoire for a second, because I just had this hilarious thought in my mind of the Pensacola Symphony or advertising, come escape the challenges, the stresses of life with classical music. And then they program like Stravinsky's Rite of Spring, just right. Like super stressful. So, how does repertoire and the audience need, how do those things merge?
Yeah. I get this question constantly because people get a little nervous when I come and say, okay, you're going to change everything about your organization. It's like, oh, does that mean we have to dumb down our repertoire? What does that mean about programming? So it all depends on what is that meaningful purpose that you've landed on, because that is your compass now for every decision that you make. So, and a meaningful purpose can be an overarching one for the organization, but it can also be specific to a gathering as well. So that kind of helps. So of course, I always say, first of all, excellence can go hand in hand with this meaningful purpose. You don't have to throw excellence out the window. You don't necessarily have to dumb down your repertoire, but you do have to think, okay, if this is what we're marketing ourselves as, if this is the solution we are now targeting, what kind of repertoire fits into that? And that is part of this differentiation of your organization now in your city. You'll be known now for programming this kind of music that does this kind of thing for your audience. And I also think there are some organizations that have found some success with weaving in. So part of this issue is this idea of familiarity and relevance to, someone's daily life. And so if they aren't familiar with the classics or, these new pieces that, new classical music pieces that are being composed today, a lot of organizations are finding success with weaving in some familiarity in the concert itself. So you might be performing, let's say, Brahms' Requiem, but maybe there's a piece, I don't know, by the Beatles or, whatever it is, that they're going to say, oh, I know that piece, and that's going to be the draw. That's going to be the relevant doorway in, so that they can then familiarize themselves with your core repertoire. So I'm sort of extrapolating from your question a little bit, but that those are the two ways that I think about repertoire.
Such an interesting question, because so much of what we do in the music ed world is how do you pick repertoire and teaching all the music ed students where to find it and how to find quality repertoire. And right now, especially as I'm picking music for honor choirs in all states, it's a different perspective right now because it's these kids, they want the excellent music, but also it's that they want to have fun, and music is their hobby. And we so often forget, because it is our career, that for the most of the world, it is a hobby, it is a pastime. They are music appreciators and music lovers. So that's such a good perspective.
Yeah, and I think for some artists, they're driven by music that is really complex and intellectually stimulating, right? But then there are the other artists who want to have an emotional experience. And so there's always that balance, I think, that you have to look for.
It's such a fun balance to find too. What are your hopes for Culture for Hire, for everything that you're doing? What do you see your organization and your company doing in the next 5 or 10 years?
I really just want to see more of this perspective being adopted and embraced. And for me, I've only been doing this work for about 2 years, and I'm already seeing people start to talk in new ways, which is, it's so exciting for me. It's not about me, really. It's about, I am an arts lover, even though I talk about it in a very different way. And I want to see arts organizations thrive. I want to see this decline, this trend in audiences shift and turn around. And so that's really what drives me with the work that I do.
I love it. Alex, do you have any other questions before we dive into our end of show questions?
No, I love it. This concept feels radical. But as someone on my end, we've started to do some of this shifted messaging over the years. And I've really seen the tangible benefits of orienting your message to fitting a need in your community. It helps not just with audience growth, but also with enrollment. I'm a youth choir person, so I need kids, like choirs, to succeed. And that shift in messaging has really transformed our program, and excellence has not changed at all. We're still doing exactly what we did. We just have more people as part of that journey.
That is such a good point. And that's the thing about this framework, is that it's so applicable to so many different industries, but also so many areas of life. I mean, I've even heard Clayton Christensen say, like, this works in marriages and relationships as well. Like, what is your partner's job to be done, or what is their need? But absolutely, when you're trying to recruit singers or musicians or artists, this works as well, because they are your customers in a different way. But absolutely, this kind of perspective helps with recruitment as well.
All right. End of show questions, although I'm pretty sure we could talk for a lot longer. I usually ask the guest what their favorite book is that they're reading right now, but I'm picking a book for you because you told me this book already at Course America. You talked about The Art of Relevance.
Yes.
It is so good. Will you give a little digestible chunk about that book to the listener, please?
Yeah. The Art of Relevance is by Nina Simon, not Nina Simone, Nina Simon. And Nina Simon is a thought leader actually in the museum space. But I don't know who it was that introduced her book to me, but I devoured it and found it so applicable to, the entire arts sector. And it is focusing on relevance and she very much uses that language around insiders and outsiders, and how, as insiders, arts organizations and artists have the responsibility of creating relevant doorways into their world for the outsiders. And she gives, actionable examples, and it's a really inspirational book. I highly recommend it. And also follow her work. I just discovered, also wrote another book called The Participatory Museum. And it's about how in 2023, interactive events aren't enough. Being invited to sit and watch or listen to art is not enough. It's not enough value, not enough meaning for consumers in 2023. And so she talks about the difference between an interactive event and a participatory event. And so that would be the second book that I would recommend. And then, of course, there's The Art of Gathering, which I mentioned earlier in the show. So those three are triple threat.
Those are great books. The SCAD Museum of Art is one of my favorite places to go. I try to go at least once a month, and it is fantastic. They just opened 2 new exhibits with artist talks that were walking around, and it was moving from this gorgeous venue where you heard the panel, but then into the art and getting to like walk around and experience it with the artists. But then I went back because they opened 2 more, and one of them is so cool. It has all of these scenes, and it's called like The Ordinary or something. It has a better name than that. But it's where these props are laid out, and you as people viewing these things aren't just viewing them, you're actually then creating your own art at these little stations. And the art on the wall is photographs of people doing these exhibits at other opening. So it's kind of this like big circle moment. There's this one I couldn't do. There were 3 oranges, and you had to stack the oranges on top of them and then put your head on top of the oranges and keep them stacked and move your hands away and count to 60. It was an epic fail a lot of times.
Wow. But there it is. There's that participatory element, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It was so much fun. I've already like told a dozen friends. I'm like, when you want to go? We got to go back. Let's go. It was so much fun.
That sounds amazing.
It's so much fun. Okay, great. I love the books. We've talked about your organization, Culture for Hire. Are there any other organizations or nonprofits or people doing great things that we should direct the listeners to?
Oh, wow. There are so many. I always come back to these thought leaders that I follow: Nina Simon, Priya Parker, and Aubrey Bergauer is another voice in the arts world who her focus is more about running an arts organization like a business and building revenue, but she's fantastic as well. And in terms of resources, one of the things that I have grown on my blog, which has become more than a blog, is what I have what I've called the Arts Marketing Hall of Fame. And it started off as just sort of a daily curation of arts marketing that actually works, arts marketing that is relevant and that speaks to the consumer. And it became a Facebook group of now almost 400 arts leaders. And so it continues to be this curation of art that works, but also we have a monthly masterclass where I bring in thought leaders, often not from the arts world, but from the business world, to talk about marketing and copywriting and relevance and things like that. So that's something that your viewers might be interested in checking out as well.
Yeah, I'll definitely link the website. I've been enjoying exploring the website. I know that Alex and I just wrote a blog last month, or maybe it was this month, August, about what we've been reading this summer. And we put that on our website, and I referenced some of the things I got from yours. It's just so incredible how we can share this knowledge and take it and propel our organizations. And I mean, your podcast is called Pivot, and it's just the perfect explanation of what we're doing right now. Instead of sitting there and whining, just pivot and flip the perspective. This is awesome. Yes. Okay. The one thing that really matters that you want the listener to walk away with.
This is hard. It's a tricky question. How do I narrow it down to one thing? I'm going to say, start from the assumption that your target audiences are outsiders, because you cannot go wrong with that. Starting with that assumption completely is going to change the way you approach your marketing, your messaging, your audience experience. It's going to engender this spirit of innovation and creativity that adds value, not just for these outsiders, making them feel more welcome, giving them more psychological safety, but also for your loyal audiences, helping them understand that it's their duty to be more welcoming to the outsiders, but also inviting them to experience your art in new ways, which I think is going to benefit everyone.
Ruth, thank you so much for this conversation. I hope those of you listening were able to see perhaps just a glimpse of how Ruth's work and this Culture for Hire work is so critical to the future of the success of arts organizations, especially choirs. There's so many great resources that you've listed, and I know Emmy's going to link them to the podcast website. And I encourage you all just to dive in with an open mind. Like we've talked about, this is hard. This is a hard thing to grasp for those of us who are so entrenched in our love for the music that we teach and that we sing and perform. But there is a bigger, broader world with a lot more people in it who can be a part of your organization too. And we just haven't met them yet. And Ruth, your work is so critical to building our audience. And we're both so grateful that you're here.
You put it so eloquently. This has been such a great conversation. Thank you guys so much for having me.
Thank you for being here.
Absolutely.
Y'all, I'm not sure how you could listen to that conversation and not just be like so inspired to go and just like dive into everything that you do and uncover every nook and cranny of your marketing, of your messaging, and ask the question, what need are we filling in our community? That conversation just validates so much of the conversations that you and Emmy and I that we've had about when we were writing the book. It satisfies so many urgent questions that I get asked at conferences or throughout the weeks by colleagues who are just like, what can I do to grow? What can I do to expand? How do we get from A to B? And it's like, I think Ruth gives us the answer. We have to think about the why. We have to think about the outsider. We have to think about the person who's not here and ask the question, why, and what need can we fill for them? And what's beautiful about it is that we don't really have to change a whole lot about our music. It's not about changing the music, which I think is the first wall that people will put up when thinking about this conversation. We don't have to change everything about what we do, but we do have to change how we communicate our relevance.
Because we have to shift that perspective. It's not about you. It's not about us. It's not about the maestro. It's about the people that are coming, that why and what. And this was such a great conversation. Thank you, Alex, for being the co-host. It was so nice to have it. And of course, this episode was also curated by our friends at the ACDA Advocacy and Collaboration Committee. So we're really excited that this can help show the power of advocacy through marketing with our friend Ruth Hartt and Culture for Hire. So in case no one has told you today, you matter. We all know that music matters, especially how we communicate to the outsiders and make arts and choir and all the things essential. And I'll see you next time on the Music Ed Matters podcast.